The first time I saw the other woman, she was standing at the foot of my husband's hospital bed, holding a little girl's hand. The child had his eyes. Not maybe. Not in the vague, sentimental way people like to compare faces. I mean his eyes. The same dark hazel color. The same heavy upper lids. The same expression he wore when he was trying not to show fear. And the woman looked at me with the kind of frozen horror that only comes when two strangers realize they have both been living inside the same lie. My husband was still half conscious then. Machines were beeping. The room smelled like antiseptic, overheated air, and bad coffee from the nurse's station. I was standing on one side of his bed. She was standing on the other. And for one long second, none of us moved. Not me. Not her. Not even the child. Then my daughter, who was 16 at the time, stepped in behind me and said the sentence that broke whatever was left of that room. "Mom," she whispered. "Why does that little girl look like Dad?" Before I tell you what happened next, let me take you back to where all of it started. And if this story resonates with you, hit like and subscribe. Only if it resonates. My name is Claire Donnelly. I was 39 years old the day I learned my husband had been living a second life for nearly a third of mine. At the time, I thought I was a woman with an ordinary marriage. Not perfect. Not glamorous. Not exciting enough for anyone to envy. But ordinary in the safest possible way. That kind of ordinary has its own seduction. You stop looking too hard at it. You stop checking the seams. You start mistaking routine for truth. I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, with my husband, Evan, and our daughter, Lutze. We had a narrow blue-gray colonial on a tree-lined street where people planted mums in fall and judged one another's recycling bins in silence. The mortgage was manageable. The kitchen needed updating. The upstairs bathroom door stuck in humid weather. Our daughter played violin badly for 3 years before getting good enough to make the suffering feel worth it. We were not rich. We were not impressive. We were the kind of family that looked stable from a passing car. And for 12 years, that was enough to keep me asleep. I met Evan when I was 24. It was late September. Cool enough for light jackets. And I was working the front desk at a physical therapy practice in Warwick while trying to figure out whether I wanted to go back to school for accounting or simply admit I was tired of being afraid of numbers. He came in to help his uncle, who owned the building, with a heating problem. I remember that clearly, because the waiting room smelled faintly of eucalyptus cleaner and old carpet. And he walked in carrying a toolbox and a folded estimate sheet, like a man who had somewhere better to be but wasn't rude about being delayed. He was 32 then, 8 years older than me. Calm. Capable. Not flashy. He had broad shoulders, an easy smile, and the kind of voice people trust too quickly because it sounds settled. There are men who charm rooms. Evan wasn't like that. He charmed women who had spent enough time around chaos to confuse steadiness with goodness. That was me. I had grown up in a home where money was inconsistent. Affection was conditional. And conflict arrived fast and loud. My mother loved us in a frantic way that left no room for peace. My father left when I was 13 and came back only in birthday cards with $10 bills folded inside and guilt that always smelled like aftershave and regret. By the time I met Evan, I did not want intensity. I wanted predictability. I wanted a man who paid his bills on time. A man who showed up when he said he would. A man who carried extra batteries in a drawer and knew how to shut off a water main. Evan was all of that. Or seemed to be. He asked me out 2 weeks later. Nothing cinematic. A quiet Italian place in Cranston with heavy red curtains and tables too close together. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He remembered details. He laughed softly instead of performing. When I told him I wanted a life that felt calm, he nodded, like a man who understood the value of that. That should have been my first warning. People who understand calm too quickly have often learned how to fake it. But back then, I heard what I wanted to hear. We got married 18 months later. Small ceremony. October. A church hall reception. My dress cost less than I wanted and more than I could really afford. He looked at me during the vows with that steady expression and held my hand like he meant it. I believed him. That is the humiliating part. People do not say aloud enough after betrayal. Not that you missed clues. That you loved sincerely inside a performance built for your exact weaknesses. The first 5 years of our marriage felt normal in all the ways that matter when you are building a life. We worked. We paid bills. We argued about paint colors. Holiday schedules. And how much takeout was too much takeout for people who owned a stove. Evan ran maintenance operations for a regional property management company. The job meant long days, emergency calls, and occasional overnight trips when one of the company's larger buildings had serious issues. Plumbing failures, boiler systems, storm damage. Nothing glamorous. That helped him. A man does not need a glamorous excuse to disappear. He just needs one that sounds practical. I worked first in medical billing and later at a small insurance office once Lucy was in school full-time. I handled schedules, school forms, dentist appointments, teacher emails. The 1,000 invisible things that hold a household together until the person doing them becomes so efficient no one sees the labor anymore. When Lucy was born, Evan cried. Real tears. That memory haunted me later because it complicated the easiest version of the story. If he had been a monster from beginning to end, I could have arranged him neatly in my mind. But betrayal is rarely that kind. People can love one thing and still betray another. They can mean it in one room and lie in the next. That is what makes it rot so deeply. For years, I would have described my husband as dependable, not affectionate in a dramatic way, not the kind of man to leave notes on mirrors or plan surprise weekends, but solid. He fixed things before I asked. He coached Lucy's softball team for 2 summers. He remembered when my mother's birthday still made me sad even after she was gone. He made coffee every morning and poured mine first. That last detail sounds so small now. But routine is where deception hides best. It borrows trust from repetition. The signs, when I look back now, were never loud. Never enough on their own. That is why this kind of story survives so long. A second phone, he claimed, was for work after hours. Cash withdrawals that were small enough not to trigger alarm and regular enough to disappear into noise. Weekends when a boiler crisis called him away right after breakfast. Holiday volunteer shifts at properties I had never visited because, in his words, you don't want to spend Christmas around busted pipes and angry tenants. He was right. I didn't. That is another thing about lies. They often wrap themselves around preferences you are relieved to keep. The first time I felt something shift was about 4 years into our marriage. Lucy was 12. Still at that age where she smelled like baby shampoo. Crackers, And sleep. Evan came home late from an emergency call, with a scratch across the back of his right hand. Not deep. Just enough for me to notice while he was washing up for dinner. "What happened?" I asked. He glanced down. "Metal edge on an access panel." "Need a Band-Aid?" "Nah." He smiled. "I've survived worse." Normal exchange. Forgettable. Except he was wearing a shirt I had never seen before. Navi thermal Henley. Too casual for work. Too new to have been lying around. When I asked about it, he said he kept a spare change of clothes in his truck because building maintenance got dirty. That made sense. I let it go. A year later, I found a receipt in his jeans from a family diner in New Bedford. 2 adult meals. 1 kid's pancake special. Orange juice. Chocolate milk. The date was a Sunday morning. He had told me he was checking storm damage in Fall River. I remember holding that receipt under the kitchen light with my thumb pressed against the total. It felt stupid to care. People pick up random food. Coworkers eat together. A foreman might have brought a nephew or a tenant's kid along for all I knew. When I asked, he barely looked at it. "Oh," he said. "Guys from one of the crews stopped for breakfast and I grabbed the check." Again. A plausible answer. That is all a long lie requires. Not perfection. Just enough plausible answers to make your own instincts feel rude. The years passed. Lucy got older. Her front teeth came in too large for her face for a while, then somehow fit perfectly. She stopped holding my hand in parking lots and started acting embarrassed when I said, "I love you," in front of her friends. Evan moved through middle age, the way he moved through everything else. Quietly. No dramatic crisis. No sports car. No visible unraveling. He wore the same boots until the soles went smooth. He kept a yellow legal pad by the fridge for household repairs. He packed his own lunches 3 days out of 5. Do you know how impossible it is to imagine a man like that living 2 lives? That was my mistake. I thought deception had an aesthetic. I thought men who lied at that scale looked obvious. Arrogant. Restless. Performative. I thought double lives belonged to men who liked attention, not men who sorted screws into labeled plastic bins in the basement. But a second family does not always grow out of appetite. Sometimes it grows out of compartmentalization. A weak man discovers he can be needed in more than one place and mistakes that for permission. Around year 7, I noticed he had become stricter about privacy. Not aggressive. Just firm. He used to leave his phone on the kitchen counter without thinking. Then gradually it was always face down. Always near him. If he showered, it went into the bathroom. If he mowed the lawn, it sat in the cup holder of the mower. If he fell asleep in the recliner, it stayed tucked under his thigh. The first time I teased him about being secretive, he smiled and said, "I manage tenant issues all day. You don't want to know half the gross stuff people send me." Again. Plausible. Again. I let it pass. This is the part listeners always judge hardest. They think they would know. They think they would search harder, push earlier, demand more. Maybe they would. But people underestimate how much marriage trains you to prioritize continuity. A suspicion is not just a suspicion once you have a mortgage, a teenager, shared history, joint tax returns, and a daughter who still assumes her father is one of the permanent facts of the universe. A suspicion becomes a wrecking ball. And most decent women do not swing one until they think they absolutely have to. There was one woman I remember now from those years. I saw her only once. At least I thought it was once. It was at a supermarket in Swansea. I was there after work. Tired. Buying pasta. Grapes. And the overpriced yogurt Lucy liked because all her friends liked it. Evan had driven separately that day because he was coming from a site visit south of us. I was near the pharmacy when I saw him at the far end of aisle 7. Not alone. He was standing with a dark-haired woman in a tan coat and a little girl in a grocery cart seat. The child couldn't have been more than 4. Evan had one hand on the cart handle and was leaning down to say something to the little girl that made her laugh. I remember freezing beside a display of paper towels. Then he looked up. Saw me. And the whole arrangement of his face changed. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like recalculation. He walked toward me right away. The woman did not. She's the on-site leasing rep for one of the Bristol properties, he said before I had even asked anything. Single mom. Her car battery died in the lot. The woman gave a quick polite smile. The little girl stared at me with solemn curiosity and one pink barrette hanging halfway out of her hair. I smiled back automatically because children deserve innocence even when adults are building rooms of dishonesty around them. Claire. This is Dana, he said. Dana. That name mattered later. At the time, it meant nothing. Nice to meet you, she said. Her voice shook. I thought she was embarrassed. Now I know it was fear. We stood there in that refrigerated grocery store air with fluorescent lights, making everyone look slightly tired and unreal. Evan was too cheerful. Too fast. The little girl was chewing the edge of a cracker packet. Dana looked like she wanted to leave. I told myself I was overreading because people look awkward all the time in accidental introductions. Then I went home and unpacked grapes and yogurt and pasta and chose not to make a scene from a moment I could not explain. That is how big betrayals keep breathing. They survive on the mercy of women who do not yet have enough evidence to justify their own alarm. There were financial things too. Never enough to break us. Never enough to scream. Just small currents moving under the floorboards. A credit card, he said, was for emergency purchases tied to work reimbursements. A checking account at a different bank I only learned about because a statement fragment showed up in the mail, and he said the company had switched payroll processing for a quarter. A life insurance policy update he handled without me because, in his words, it was just paperwork. Just paperwork is one of the most dangerous phrases in any marriage. People use it when they want to move past the part that matters, before you realize it matters. When Lucy was 12, she started noticing things before I did. Teenagers see emotional weather with annoying accuracy. One Friday evening, Evan canceled a planned dinner out because of a burst pipe at an apartment complex in Taunton. Lucy rolled her eyes so hard it was almost athletic. Dad has more emergencies than an ER, she muttered after he left. I told her not to be disrespectful. She shrugged. I'm just saying. I remember standing at the stove stirring jarred sauce while those 3 words sat in the kitchen like a draft. I'm just saying. The terrible thing is that children often sense truth long before adults allow themselves to touch it. But when truth threatens a structure, the whole family lives inside. Adults become editors. We cut. We smooth. We explain. We protect the shape until the shape collapses anyway. At 14, Lucy asked me if I ever worried her father would leave us. The question came out of nowhere. We were folding laundry on a Sunday afternoon. Raine. Windows fogged slightly in the den. The television on mute. She was pairing socks and pretending not to care about the answer. "Why would you ask that?" I said. She shrugged without looking up. "He's gone a lot. For work." "I know." Then she added, "I just mean, if he wanted to leave. He probably could. He already kind of lives like he has another place." I laughed then. Not because it was funny, because some part of me wanted to scare the sentence away by treating it like teenage moodiness. "Your father loves you," I said. That was true. I still believe it was true. But love and loyalty are not the same thing. That is another ugly lesson I did not understand until much later. When Lucy turned 16, things in our house became more brittle. Not because of one event. Because adolescence has a way of stripping politeness out of whatever adults are trying hardest not to examine. She and Evan argued more about curfews, phone use, school pressure, everything small that is never really small. He still loved her. But his patience had thinned in a way I mistook for age and stress. Sometimes he would come home from these supposed work emergencies already drained, already irritable, already used up. At the time, I thought he was overworked. Now I know that splitting yourself across two households makes even decent emotions feel rationed. He wasn't just tired. He was divided. Still, if you had asked me that spring whether I thought my husband was hiding a whole second family, I would have looked at you like you were insane. En affaire? Maybe. That would have been almost easier to imagine. A one-night mistake. A fling. Something ugly but familiar. But another woman and a child? Years? Birthdays? School clothes? Doctor appointments? A life built in parallel to mine? No, that seemed too elaborate for ordinary people like us. That is another illusion, marriage teaches. You think massive deceit requires dramatic people. It doesn't. It only requires repeated choices protected by routine. The thing that finally cracked everything open was not suspicion. It was a hard episode. On a Tuesday morning in late January, Evan called me from work sounding wrong. Not panicked. Worse. Tight. Flat. Measured in the way people get when they are trying to sound normal because they know if they don't, someone will hear the danger in it immediately. "Claire," he said, "I'm at St. Anne's in Fall River. They want to run some tests. Probably nothing." Nothing is rarely nothing when said that way. What happened? Chest pain. Dizziness. They think maybe stress or some rhythm thing. I'm fine. You're not fine if you're at the hospital. Can you come? That was the first thing that mattered. Not where he was. Not why he had chosen that hospital instead of something closer to Providence. Just that he asked me. Yes. I said, "I'm leaving now." I picked up Lucy from school because she would never have forgiven me if I left her out of that kind of moment. And because at 16, she was old enough to understand that sometimes families pause normal life all at once. The drive to Fall River was gray and wet. Bare trees. Dirty snow pushed to road shoulders. That flat winter light New England gets when the whole day looks like it has been rubbed with cold fingers. Lucy sat beside me in the passenger seat. Knees up. hands wrapped around her phone. "Do you think he's okay?" she asked. "I don't know." That was all I had. Hospitals narrow a person immediately. By the time we found parking, walked through the sliding doors, and reached the cardiac observation floor, my body had already moved into that strange administrative panic people perform in medical spaces. Sigh 9. Ask questions. Listen carefully. Do not cry yet. The hallway smelled like hand sanitizer and microwaved soup. The nurse at the desk gave us Evan's room number and said visiting was limited, but she'd make an exception for immediate family if we kept it calm. Immediate family. That phrase catches in me now. At the time, it meant me and Lucy. Nothing else? We walked down the corridor together. I remember the patterned floor tiles, the hum of fluorescent lights, a man coughing behind one of the curtains in another room, a television somewhere playing a daytime court show too loudly. When we reached Evan's room, the door was half open. I pushed it gently, and there she was, the woman from the supermarket, older now, but unmistakable. Dark hair pinned back loosely, tan wool coat folded over one arm, one hand gripping the bed rail, the other holding the hand of a little girl who looked about 11 or 12, old enough now that the resemblance hit like impact. His eyes, his mouth, his way of holding tension in the jaw. And beside me, I heard Lucy stop breathing for half a second. Evan looked from me to her, from her to the child, then to Lucy. The monitor started beeping faster. Nobody spoke. The room was too full for silence and too shocked for language. Then the little girl looked at Evan and said, in the plain, unguarded voice only children can still use inside disaster, "Daddy, who are they?" Everything in me went cold. Not hot. Cold. Like my body understood before my thoughts lined up. My husband closed his eyes. The woman tightened her grip on the child's hand. Lucy stepped forward 1 inch and then stopped. I could feel her beside me, rigid and alert, and suddenly, older than 16. I looked at the woman. She looked at me. And I knew. Not affair, not fling, not mistake. A life. A whole second life. I heard myself ask the first stupid human question that ever comes out of people when the truth is already obvious. How do you know my husband? The woman's face changed in a way I will never forget. Not guilt first. Recognition. Recognition that I had not known, which meant she had not known either. That was the moment the floor truly dropped out. Because betrayal is one shape. Mutual betrayal is another. The little girl looked between us. Mom? Mom. So there it was. She was not the mistress waiting for scraps in the shadows. She was another wife-shaped figure, in another life-shaped room. Evan tried to sit up too fast. The heart monitor protested. Claire, he said, voice thin. Please. Please. That was what he chose. Not explanation. Not confession. Please. Behind me, Lucy whispered. Mom. But she did not say it like a child asking for help. She said it like someone bracing for impact. The woman finally found her voice. Her lips were trembling. I'm sorry, she said to me. I thought you were his sister. That sentence broke the room open in a way screaming never could have. His sister, after 12 years of marriage, after a mortgage, after holidays, after school concerts and emergency root canals, and ordinary Tuesdays, and all the little unpaid labor of being someone's actual wife, I had been reduced in another woman's understanding to his sister. I almost laughed. That close to hysteria laugh grief sometimes puts in your throat when reality becomes too grotesque to enter cleanly. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. How long? Evan swallowed. Claire? How long? The woman answered before he did. 12 years, she said. And Lucy made a sound beside me that I had never heard from her before. Not crying. Not anger. Something lower. Something like trust tearing. For a second, nobody moved. Not me. Not Lucy. Not the other woman. Not even, though the monitor beside him had started beeping fast enough to sound angry. 12 years, she said again, but quieter this time, as if the number itself had become too heavy to hold at full volume. The little girl looked up at her. Mom? Lucy stepped back so abruptly, her shoulder hit the doorframe. I turned toward Evan. He had gone gray under the fluorescent light. Not sick gray. Exposed gray. He looked like a man who had spent 12 years building walls and was now watching the load-bearing beam crack in front of him. Explain, I said. That was all. One word. But it carried everything. The woman stared at him too. She looked stunned in a different direction than I was. Not betrayed by discovery. Betrayed by structure. By realizing she had not been the hidden exception. She had been one side of a mirror. Evan swallowed. Claire. Please. Not here. That sentence did something cold and clean inside me. Not here. In a hospital room. In front of 2 daughters. In front of the woman he had been lying beside in one life and lying to in another. He still thought place management mattered more than truth. I took one step closer to the bed. Not here is over. The little girl tightened against her mother's leg. She looked terrified. That stopped me from saying what I really wanted to say. Not because Evan deserved mercy. Because children should not be used as witnesses to adult cruelty, more than absolutely necessary. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was shaking hard now. My name is Dana, she said to me. He told me he was divorced. The room changed again. Divorced. Not separated. Not complicated marriage. Divorced. A whole solved past handed to another woman like paperwork. I almost laughed. Instead I asked, "Since when?" She looked at Evan, then back at me. "Since before she was born," she said, tightening her hand around the little girl's shoulder. She didn't say the child's name. Not yet. Maybe she was protecting her. Maybe protecting herself. Lucy turned to Evan so sharply, I thought she might actually strike him. "You had another kid?" she said. There are sentences that sound childish until you hear the wound inside them. Not another family. Another kid. Her first math was blood. Evan opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Lucy. No. She snapped. No. Don't say my name, like everything's normal. The little girl flinched. Dana pulled her closer and looked at Lucy with the sort of horrified sympathy that only deepened the humiliation. That was the part I had not prepared for in the first 30 seconds. Not just that he had lied, that he had created a room where my daughter and another child had to process each other as collateral damage. I looked at Dana. How much did you know? She shook her head immediately. Nothing defensive in it. Only shock. He said his first marriage ended years ago. He said it was messy and private, and his ex didn't want contact. He said... Her voice broke. He said he had one daughter who didn't speak to him. Lucy made a sound that was half laugh, half something closer to pain. I live with him, she said. Dana closed her eyes. Just for a second. When she opened them again, something in her had hardened. Not against me. Against him. Good. I needed that. A nurse appeared at the doorway then, drawn by the monitor and the rising voices. Everything okay in here? No. Nothing in there was okay. Maya wasn't in this story. No friend standing by. Just me. Lucy. Dana. The child. And a nurse who had accidentally walked into the implosion of a man's architecture. Dana answered before I could. No, she said flatly, but none of this is your fault. The nurse looked at the girls first. That told me she was good at her job. Maybe we need to lower the stress level for the patient. I almost turned and said something cruel. Instead, I took a breath and asked, "Is there somewhere else we can talk?" The nurse, who had likely seen every version of family disaster except this exact one, nodded quickly. There's a consultation room at the end of the hall, but 1 or 2 at a time. No, Lucy said. Her face had gone rigid in a way I'd never seen before. No, he talks now. She was right. If we left that room, he would have time to organize. Weak men are never more dangerous than when they regain access to sequence. Dana looked at him, then at me, then said, I agree. So that was how it began. No dramatic slap. No screaming fit. Just 2 women who had been lied to in opposite directions deciding, in the same second, not to give him another private corridor. Evan pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. He looked older than he had that morning. Not from illness. From collapse. I was going to tell you both, he said. There it was. The first lie offered from inside the ruins of the larger ones. I stared at him. When? I asked. In the afterlife? Dana actually laughed at that. One sharp, humorless burst. It sounded like a glass breaking. The little girl looked from her mother to me. Then she said, very quietly, Mom, is he my dad? Everything stopped again. Dana crouched immediately in front of her. Yes. Sweetheart, she said. But who are they? There is no gentle language for that moment. No correct sentence. No version that leaves children whole. Dana looked at me, and I understood instantly what the look meant. Help me not lie to her the way he lied to all of us. So I knelt too. Lucy stayed standing. Arms wrapped around herself so tightly, I thought her bones might bruise. I said, carefully, I'm Claire, and I'm his wife. The little girl blinked, then looked at Dana, and then back at me. You're married to my dad? I nodded once. The child's face didn't crumble the way I expected. It emptied. That was worse. Children don't always cry first when the world shifts. Sometimes they just go still while their minds rearrange the furniture. Dana stood slowly. Her whole body had changed now. She wasn't the frightened woman from the supermarket anymore. She wasn't even the shocked woman from 30 seconds ago. She was a mother looking at the man who had just detonated reality in front of her daughter. "What is her name?" I asked. Dana answered without taking her eyes off him. "Rose." Rose. I still remember feeling anger at how pretty the name was. As if beauty itself had become an insult. Lucy whispered. He named her after Grandma's middle name. That hit me like a slap. My mother-in-law's middle name was Rose. So he had not just hidden another child. He had braided our lives together in ways neither side could even see. I stood. Very slowly. "Start from the beginning," I said to Evan. "And don't insult me with half-truths." He looked at Dana first. That told me more than anything else. His instinct was still strategic. Still trying to read which collapse to manage first. Dana saw it too. "Oh. No," she said quietly. "Look at your wife when you lie." That was the moment I knew something essential. Whatever happened next, I would not be fighting another woman for scraps of dignity. He had built one betrayal. Not a rivalry. That mattered. He started with the version cowards. Always start with, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." No accountability. Just a complaint about timing. Lucy made a disgusted noise. Dana's face went perfectly blank. I said nothing. Silence has a way of forcing men like that to keep walking until they reach the cliff themselves. So he kept talking. He met Dana through a commercial property project in New Bedford 12 years earlier. At the time, Lucy was 4. Dana worked part-time in office administration for a contractor tied to one of his maintenance sites. He said they connected. I almost laughed again. Connected. As if emotional language could soften arithmetic. Then Dana interrupted him. "No," she said. "You told me your divorce had been final for 2 years." He looked down. I was separated emotionally. Lucy made a sound like she might choke. That sentence. That's stupid. Borrowed sentence men use when they want adult cowardice to sound philosophical. I stepped forward. "You were eating dinner in my house?" He flinched. "Good." Dana asked the next question before I could. "When did you marry her?" He told her. I watched the date hit her. Watched her count backward in real time. Watched the exact second she realized she had begun as an affair with a married man and had never been given the dignity of informed choice. Rose was coloring on the edge of a discharge pamphlet with a nurse's pen she must have picked up from the counter. That image still lives in me. A child drawing circles while adults tore down the walls around her. Dana asked, "How long after we met?" He answered too softly. 3 months. She laughed once, then put her hand over her mouth like she regretted giving the room even that much. "You got me pregnant while you were still sleeping in her bed." Not a question. A verdict. Evan looked like he wanted the monitor to save him. It didn't. Machines can track a heart. They can't restore a spine. At some point, a second nurse stepped in and said he needed rest, and this was not good for cardiac observation. That phrase irritated me more than it should have. not good for cardiac observation. As though his body had suddenly become the most fragile thing in the room. Dana looked at me. We need to talk somewhere else. She was right. The first explosion had already happened. The next part needed structure. I turned to Lucy. Come on. Lucy stared at Evan for one long second. Then said, Don't call me until I decide you're still my father. That sentence took the air out of the room more effectively than anything I had said. We left. Dana brought Rose. The consultation room at the end of the hall had 6 chairs. A box of tissues. Beige voids. And a landscape print meant to calm people who were receiving the kinds of news that permanently separate their lives into before and after. Rose sat in the corner with a cup of apple juice, a nurse brought, and a coloring book someone found. That broke me more than the lie did. If I'm honest, the hospital had already understood what kind of day this was before any of us had. Dana and I sat opposite each other. Lucy stood for a while before finally dropping into the chair beside me. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Then Dana said, I need you to know I didn't know. I know. I said, and I did. Not because she looked sorry, because of what she had asked in the room, because of the way her shock moved. Liars react differently than victims. She was rearranging, not performing. I thought his ex-wife hated him. She said that there'd been some custody issue years ago. He said his daughter didn't want anything to do with him. He said he sent money for school and tried to keep contact respectful. Lucy laughed bitterly. He drove me to violin lessons. Dana closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. He had holidays with us every other year. She said, he said he worked property emergencies the years he couldn't. I thought of Christmas mornings with half-assembled toys and coffee and cinnamon rolls, and Evan checking his phone just a little too often. I thought of the Thanksgivings he covered for a boiler team, while I packed leftovers into plastic containers, and told Lucy her father worked hard for us. Routine. That's where the rot lived. Dana had a condo in New Bedford. That was where he stayed during storm weekends. He helped with Rose's school drop-offs on some Tuesdays because his route lined up with work sites. He had another phone for building emergencies. Another checking account because property reimbursements got messy. Every practical lie I had accepted in one life had a matching use in another. That was the most nauseating discovery of all. He hadn't even been creative. Just efficient. How much money? I asked. Dana looked confused for half a second. Then understood. Her mouth tightened. I don't know. I nodded. But the truth had already started sorting itself in my head. 2 households. 2 sets of gifts. 2 sets of bills. 2 stories requiring maintenance. Lies like that are expensive. They don't survive on emotion alone. Dana finally asked me the question she had likely been holding since the hallway. Did you ever suspect? That question deserved honesty. Yes. I said, not this. Never this. But pieces. Enough that I asked sometimes. Enough that I let plausible answers make me feel rude. She nodded slowly. I found a photo once. She said, in his glove box, a little girl at the beach. He said it was his niece. Lucy looked at her. What beach? Dana frowned. Misquamicut. I think. Lucy went white. That was our beach trip, she said. The room went silent. Of course it was. Of course he had carried proof of one child into the orbit of the other and simply trusted time to blur it. That is the thing about men who run double lives for too long. They stop being careful. Success turns into arrogance. And arrogance always leaks. I asked Dana if anyone else knew. His family? Friends? Coworkers? Nobody knew the whole truth. As far as she could tell. His brother knew he helped out a woman in a hard situation. A coworker covered 1 or 2 overnight stories. Her sister had always thought he was secretive, but assumed it was because of a painful divorce history. That part mattered too. He had outsourced pieces of the lie across multiple people. No one held the whole architecture except him. Which meant when it fell, everyone would be discovering their own small participation in it. Rose eventually looked up from her coloring book and asked the question both girls had been circling without language. Does this mean we're sisters? Lucy turned toward her. I held my breath. 16 is old enough to be cruel and young enough to do it by instinct. But Lucy looked at that child for a long second and then, very quietly, said, Yeah, I guess it does. Rose nodded as if this were strange but manageable. Children can absorb impossible truths with frightening efficiency when adults stop lying long enough for them to do it. I remember thinking then that the girls were going to be the only decent thing to come out of that room if we handled the next few days correctly. Then the practical world entered. As it always does, Dana and I exchanged numbers. Real numbers. Not through him. Not through stories. Direct line. That mattered immediately. We agreed on one thing before anything else. Neither of us would allow Evan to control the sequence anymore. No private meetings. No separate explanations. No staggered versions crafted to manage reactions. If he wanted to confess, he would do it in the presence of both women he had lied to. And if he wanted mercy, he could start by giving up control. That afternoon, while Evan remained under observation, Dana and I sat in the hospital cafeteria with paper cups of burnt coffee and began mapping our lives against each other. 12 years. Work trips. Christmas absences. Storm weekends. Tax season overtime. All of it. Like laying 2 transparencies on top of each other and discovering they were the same image in reverse. The year Lucy had pneumonia, he had left our house early one Sunday for a flooded basement emergency. Dana checked her phone and found photos from that same day. Rose's 3rd birthday party. There he was in the background holding a plastic princess crown. The summer he missed our anniversary dinner because of a roofing issue in Newport. Dana had a picture of him grilling burgers on a beach rental deck in Bristol with her and Rose. The morning he told me he had to drive to Worcester for supplies. He had actually been at Rose's school play. This was not a double life built out of rare opportunities. It was a calendar. A system. A second domestic rhythm nested inside mine. At one point, Dana put her phone down and said, "How did he think this would end?" I answered before I could stop myself. He didn't. That is the truth about people who live like this for too long. They do not plan endings. They plan extensions. One more lie. One more month. One more excuse. They don't build future outcomes. They rent borrowed time until the structure collapses. By evening, the girls were exhausted. Lucy had gone cold and brittle. Rose had become unnaturally quiet. Dana took Rose home. I took Lucy. Before we left, Evan tried to call me from the room phone. He let it ring. Then he texted, "Please don't leave like this." Like this? As though there were a correct aesthetic for leaving the scene of your husband's double life. I wrote back 3 words. "You already did." That night in our house, Lucy sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing, while I moved through the room with the false efficiency of a person trying not to shatter in front of her child. I made tea no one drank. I opened and closed cabinets. I wiped a counter that was already clean. Finally, Lucy said, "Did everybody know except us?" That question cut straight to the deepest fear. Not that he lied. That our whole life had been an audience. "I don't think so," I said. I was careful not to say I knew. Because betrayal destroys trust fastest when certainty turns out to be decorative. She nodded once, then asked, "Was I not enough?" There it was. The sentence, children always drag out of adult betrayal sooner or later. I sat beside her immediately. "No," I said, "this is not about enough." "How do you know?" Because I knew the answer intellectually and hated how little that helped. Because weak men don't create second families because one child is lacking. They do it because appetite and cowardice make room where character should have stood. But 16-year-old girls don't hear systems. They hear replacement. So I put my hand over hers and said the only true thing that mattered. Because nothing about this was built by your worth. It was built by his lying. She cried then. Hard. Finally. And I let her because some grief needs witnesses more than words. When she went upstairs hours later, I stayed at the kitchen table with my laptop and did the first thing I should have done years earlier. I pulled every financial record I could access. Joint accounts, card statements, tax returns, insurance records, mortgage history, cell phone bills, the practical skeleton of a marriage. Once you stop assuming innocence, paperwork becomes literature. There were patterns immediately. Small ATM withdrawals around New Bedford. Consistent fuel purchases near routes he did not need for work. A life insurance policy beneficiary update from 6 years earlier I had never fully reviewed because he had told me it was just employer paperwork. It wasn't. Lucy and I were still beneficiaries on the primary policy. But there was a supplemental policy through a private carrier with no visible paperwork in the house. I printed everything. Because that is what betrayal does to some women. It turns us from wives into archivists overnight. The next morning, Dana texted me before 8. He called 12 times. I texted back. Mine too. Then she sent another message. We should meet before he gets discharged. Yes. I wrote. Hospital conference lounge. 10? Yes. That was how the alliance began. Not friendship. Not yet. But alignment. 2 women with enough pain to hate each other, choosing instead to aim correctly. But then, Evan had been cleared for discharge with medication. Follow-up appointments. And the kind of stern doctor language men always promise to take seriously, while assuming life will still organize itself around their preferences. Dana and I met before going upstairs. She had barely slept either. I could see it in the carefulness of her makeup and the way her hands kept folding and unfolding around her car keys. Do we tell him together? She asked. Yes. And the girls? Yes. No staggered timelines. No private edits. He had controlled information for 12 years. That ended now. When we entered the room, he already looked more afraid than sick. Lucy stood near the window. Rose clung to Dana's side. I stayed near the door. Physical distance suddenly mattered in symbolic ways. Evan looked at each of us in turn and said, "I know I've done something terrible." Lucy actually laughed. "You think?" Dana said nothing. I said, "We're going to do this once. Clearly. Then you don't get to rewrite it later." He nodded. "Good." Then I laid out the terms. He would tell the truth in front of all four of us. No minimizing. No language like complicated or happened or mistakes were made. Truth with dates. Truth with names. Truth with money. Truth with sequence. If he lied once, we walked. He agreed too quickly. That bothered me. Not because I thought he was sincere, because men like that often mistake the first moment of honesty for absolution. So he began. He met Dana 12 years earlier during a commercial renovation project. He was attracted to the life she represented, or at least that was how he framed it. "Things were hard at home," he said. I stopped him immediately. "No, try again." He blinked. "What?" "Do not build this on my marriage becoming your excuse." Dana looked at me then. And that was the first moment something like respect passed cleanly between us. He tried again. "Hemedana." He lied about being divorced. He kept seeing her because stopping would require confessing. Then Dana got pregnant. That should have ended it. Instead, he extended the lie to cover the consequence. He rented a small place in New Bedford under a story about work-related crash space during emergencies. He paid part of the bills there through a separate account. He created scheduling systems every other holiday. Alternating excuses. Work weekends. Storm calls. Late supply runs. Insurance paperwork filed through different channels. He called Rose his daughter openly there. He called Lucy my kid or my girl here. Two vocabularies. Two selves. Same coward. Dana asked, "Did you ever plan to marry me?" He looked down. No. The honesty was ugly, but at least it was honest. She nodded once, then asked, "Did you ever plan to leave your wife?" Long pause. No. There it was. Not love triangle. Not impossible choice. Consumption. He had not been divided by passion. He had been preserved by deceit. Lucy asked the worst question next. Which family was real? Evan started crying. Actual tears. I want to be clear about this. I do not think every tear from a liar is fake. Sometimes people truly grieve the damage they caused once they are forced to see it from outside themselves. But remorse is not repair. And pain is not innocence. Both, he said. Lucy shook her head. No, that's not an answer. Rose looked frightened again. Dana knelt beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. I said, "The answer is he made both real enough to hurt." That was the only truthful version available. After the confession, practical matters came quickly. Where had he spent money? Whose names were on what? What policies existed? What debts? What obligations? Evan had spent so many years managing emotional realities that he had neglected the arrogance of paperwork. That helped us. The second apartment had been closed 2 years earlier when Dana bought her condo. But records still existed. There were private school tuition contributions for Rose in years when he had told me he was cutting personal spending to manage economic uncertainty. There was a private life insurance policy naming Dana as partial beneficiary and Rose as contingent beneficiary. There were hotel records from maintenance conferences that were nothing of the sort. There were enough financial traces to make denial impossible. I asked him one final question before leaving. Who else knew? He said no one knew everything. His brother knew some. A supervisor had signed off on flexible coverage without asking too many questions. That was it. No grand conspiracy. Just a man using the laziness of other people's assumptions as infrastructure. By the end of that conversation, I knew exactly what I wanted. Not revenge theater. Not one giant screaming collapse. Sequence. Protection. Distance. I told him then, in front of everyone, that I was not coming back to the marriage. Dana looked at me sharply. Not surprised. Anchored. Good. Then I added the part that mattered even more. And from this point forward, every conversation about the girls, the finances, or the house happens in writing. He opened his mouth, closed it again. That was the first healthy thing he had done all day. The weeks that followed were ugly in the most administrative way possible. I met with a lawyer, then a forensic accountant on my lawyer's recommendation. Dana did the same, though her legal position was different because she had not been married to him. Lucy refused to see Evan for nearly a month. Rose saw him twice with Dana present and came home afterward with stomachaches. The house turned into evidence. Every drawer, every file cabinet, every old phone upgrade box, every tax folder, every receipt. You learn very quickly, during the collapse of a marriage, that normal objects become witnesses. A mileage log, a spare key, a hardware store receipt near the wrong city, an anniversary card bought the same weekend. Another woman has photos from a beach rental. Time started sorting itself into categories. Family memory, now contaminated. Financial history, now interpreted. Legal sequence, now urgent. Evan moved into a short-term corporate rental, his company arranged, though by then I suspect they understood far more than they wanted to officially know. His HR department called his hospitalization a private matter. His supervisor called his schedule inconsistencies regrettable. Men like him survive for years because institutions love vagueness almost as much as cowards do. But once divorce counsel got involved, vagueness started becoming risk. That changed things. There is no need to glorify the legal process. It is exhausting, expensive, cold. But sometimes cold systems are useful because they make manipulation harder. My attorney, a woman named Andrea Feld, had the exact kind of mind I needed then. Unromantic, precise. Not interested in my tears except where they revealed timelines. She said one thing in our first meeting I still remember word for word. Infidelity is emotional harm. Sustained financial deception is actionable structure. That sentence steadied me instantly, because she understood this was not just adultery. It was a parallel domestic economy. That matters. We uncovered enough to prove marital funds had supported the second household in multiple ways over many years. Not enough to destroy us financially forever. Enough to matter. Enough to reshape settlement. Enough to puncture any last little fantasy he may have had about this becoming a sad but private moral failing. No, it had paper. Dana and I continued speaking through all of it. At first, only logistics. School schedules. What the girls had been told. What Evan had said. Which documents had surfaced. Then, gradually, more. Not intimacy exactly. Something harder earned. Recognition. We were not friends in the casual sense. We were two women learning how to keep one man's weakness from becoming the defining relationship between us. That mattered more than I can explain. The easiest story would have been for us to hate each other. Society loves that version. It keeps the man centered even in disgrace. We refused it. That refusal was its own kind of revenge. The macro peak, if I had to name one, came not in the hospital room but 6 weeks later at Lucy's school orchestra fundraiser. Evan had not been told to stay away. Not yet. Legally, he was still her father. Emotionally, he was radioactive. He showed up anyway. Alone. In a Navy quarter zip, carrying the expression of a man hoping public normalcy might force private forgiveness. Lucy saw him across the gym and went white. I was with Dana and Rose near the refreshment table because by then, yes, we had started handling some things together for the girls' sake. And because hiding no longer served anyone except him, that visual alone turned heads. Me, Dana, Luce, Rose. One man's two families standing inside one fluorescent school gym under handmade fundraiser banners and folding chair music. Evan started toward us. I saw the calculation in his face. Not apology. Optics. He thought maybe public softness could reopen a door. Lucy took one step back. Then another. And Rose, who was holding Dana's hand, said in a small, clear voice that carried farther than anyone wanted, "Why does Daddy always make everybody cry?" The gym went quiet around us in that terrible social way where not everyone hears the words, but enough people hear the silence that follows them. Evan stopped walking. Dana bent down immediately to steady Rose. Lucy looked at him with pure contempt. No teenage drama. Just contempt. And I understood with perfect clarity that this was the real public collapse. Not because strangers might infer scandal. Because both daughters now saw him in the same frame. No separate scripts. No separate roles. No place left to perform. He said, "Can we please not do this here?" And Lucy, God help me, turned his own old language back on him with surgical precision. "Not here is over," she said. I could have cried from pride and grief at the same time. Instead, I stood straighter and said, loud enough for the nearby parents and volunteers to hear clearly, "You need to leave." He looked at me, then at Dana, then at the girls. No one moved toward him. No one rescued him. He left. That was the first time I saw what consequence looks like when it finally enters a man's body through social fact instead of private discomfort. After that, the divorce moved faster. Not because the law became merciful, because he understood leverage had changed. The settlement was not cinematic. No judge delivering a speech. No dramatic courtroom confession. But it was fair enough to let me breathe. Marital assets were rebalanced in light of the concealed expenditures. The house was sold. Lucy's education fund was protected. I kept a larger share of liquid assets than he expected. He absorbed debt tied to his private deceptions. The life insurance structures were corrected. And every parenting arrangement after that came with written requirements that made spontaneity a privilege he had not earned. Dana did not get legal revenge in the same form I did. That still angers me in abstract ways. The law is better at processing wives than unwitting second families. But she did get truth on record where finances overlapped and representations had consequences. She also got out. That mattered. She sold the condo within the year and moved closer to her sister. Not to disappear. Toreshet. Rose changed schools. Lucy started therapy. Then I did too. Because betrayal like that does not just break trust in one man. It corrupts pattern recognition. For a while I doubted everything. If the coffee poured first had been love, if the softball coaching had been guilt management, if the tears when Lucy was born had been real, my therapist said something once that helped. Not every true thing is canceled by a false one, but falsehood changes custody. I wrote that down because it explained the feeling exactly. Maybe he loved Lucy. Maybe he loved Rose. Maybe he meant parts of both lives in the moment he lived them. But after 12 years of structured deceit, he no longer got to own the meaning of those moments by himself. The people he hurt got a vote now. About a year later, the girls met for lunch by choice. Not forced. Not arranged by him. By choice. That is one of the few details in this story that still feels like grace. Lucy was 17 then. Rose was 12. They met at a diner halfway between our towns with Dana and me at a nearby table. Close enough to help. Far enough to let them speak without being managed. At first they looked awkward. Of course they did. How do half-sisters begin? Not with memory. Not with family folklore. With wreckage. But after 20 minutes, Rose was showing Lucy a drawing on her tablet. And Lucy was explaining how terrible middle school orchestra can be. And I realized the girls were doing what the adults had failed to do for years. They were adapting without lying. That is stronger than forgiveness. That is survival with accuracy. Evan remained in their lives unevenly after that. Lucy kept him at distance. Birthdays sometimes. Graduation. Eventually. Texts answered on her own timetable. Rose, being younger, went through more waves. Need. Anger. Hope. Disappointment. Children are often more merciful than their fathers deserve. That is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is just age. As for me, I did not remarry quickly, or date at all for a long time. The first year after the divorce, I thought peace would feel like emptiness. Instead, it felt expensive and unfamiliar. A Saturday with no explanation due. A bank statement that did not require interpretation. A holiday that happened exactly where it was supposed to happen. The relief of singularity. People underestimate that. One life. One address. One story. No hidden scaffolding. I moved into a smaller townhouse with better light and less history. I painted the bedroom a muted green Evan would have called impractical. I bought a couch without consulting anyone who didn't live there. I learned that ease after deception is not joy exactly. It is oxygen. There is one final scene I should tell you about. 2 years after the hospital day, Lucy graduated high school. Dana and Rose came. Not because we were pretending to be a unified family, because the girls wanted them there. Evan came too. Of course. He stood 3 rows behind us with the posture of a man who knew his place had been reduced but not eliminated. After the ceremony, Lucy came over in her cap and gown and took photos. With me, with Dana and Rose, and then, after a pause that felt honest, with Evan. Not because he had earned restoration, because she had decided what she could carry. That is her right. Not his reward. Later, when everyone had gone, and I was putting the folded lawn chairs back into the trunk of my car, Dana came up beside me and said, "We really should hate each other." I laughed. I know. She looked out across the nearly empty parking lot. But he doesn't get that ending. No, he didn't. And that may be the cleanest truth in this whole story. The revenge was never screaming. Never humiliation for its own sake. Never me taking a lover. Or burning his shirts. Or making a dramatic scene in a restaurant while strangers applauded. The revenge was sequence. The revenge was accuracy. The revenge was refusing to let his lie become a war between women or a permanent inheritance for the girls. The revenge was building a life where his absence no longer felt like missing architecture. So, if you ask me whether I hate him, the answer is not simple. I hate what he built. I hate what it did to Lucy. I hate that Rose entered the world through a lie she didn't choose. I hate the years of ordinary tenderness that now have to live under cross-examination. But hatred takes intimacy too. And I no longer give him that much room. What I have instead is placement. He belongs in the category of people who shaped my life permanently, but no longer get to define its tone. That is what boundary means after a betrayal this large. Not amnesia. Not absolution. Placement. The right people close. The wrong people limited. The truth kept where it can breathe. Sometimes women write to me after hearing this story and ask what the first real clue was. The answer is unsatisfying. There wasn't one. There were 100 small mercies I extended to a man who used each one as cover. That is not stupidity. It is what trust looks like before it learns caution. If you are listening to this and blaming yourself for not seeing sooner, listen carefully. Some lies are not discovered late because you are weak. They are discovered late because you were operating in good faith, and the other person was not. That difference matters. It matters morally. It matters psychologically. It matters in the body. Because shame always rushes to occupy whatever truth has not yet been named. So name it. He lied. He split himself. He borrowed your reality to subsidize another one. That is not your failure. That is his character. By the time all of this surfaced, I was 40. Old enough to understand that not every ending needs to feel victorious to be right. What I wanted at the start was an explanation big enough to make the years make sense. I never got that. There is no explanation big enough. Weakness. Appetite. Compartmentalization. Cowardice. Choose any 4. They still don't fully account for the damage. What I got instead was better. I got the truth arranged in the correct order. I got my daughter back from confusion. I got another woman out of the same fire. And I got to watch 2 girls who should have been enemies in a cheaper story choose something wiser than the adults who made them sisters. That has to count for something. The day both families met in that hospital room did change everything. Not because the truth arrived kindly. It didn't. It arrived under fluorescent lights, with bad coffee in the air, and a heart monitor tattling in the background. But it arrived. And once it did, no one in that story ever had to live inside his preferred version of reality again. That is the thing about exposure. It does not heal you immediately. It just stops the leak. After that, healing becomes possible. Not fast. Not clean. Posible. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. And if you've ever had to rebuild after realizing your ordinary life was hiding something enormous, leave one word in the comments. Accuracy. Because sometimes that is the first form of peace.